Attention all units. Escaped psychiatric patient, male, approximately 70 years old, last sighting near Grand Central. Consider him potentially dangerous. He holds in his hands a worn briefcase. Subscribe to the channel and leave your feedback comment. Sir, I need you to accompany me, Bradley said, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Henry, taken by surprise, looked at the officer with a mixture of confusion and concern. Sorry, officer, but there must be some mistake. I'm just a retired teacher waiting for my train. Bradley, however, didn't seem interested in Henry's explanations. With a sudden movement, he grabbed the teacher's arm, making him stand up. Don't try to resist. You fit the description of a dangerous suspect. Come with me now. The scene began to attract the attention of passers-by. Curious and worried looks turned to Henry and the officer. The professor, remaining calm and dignified, decided to follow Bradley's orders, hoping that the misunderstanding would be quickly cleared up. As he was led out of the station, Henry noticed a young officer observing the scene with an expression of discomfort. It was Officer James Miller, recently graduated from the academy and not yet fully hardened by the police routine. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Henry saw a flicker of doubt and compassion in them. Outside, a crowd was beginning to form. Murmurs of indignation and confusion echoed among the people. "Why are you arresting that man?" a woman asked loudly. "He looks so harmless," another man commented. Henry was taken to the police cruiser, his mind spinning with thoughts of what could have caused this absurd situation. He tried once again to explain his identity, but Bradley cut him off sharply. "Save your stories for the police station," the officer said dismissively. As the squad car pulled away from Grand Central Station, Henry looked out the window, seeing his briefcase with his precious notes being left behind on the bench where he had been sitting. He felt a pang of sadness, not just at the potential loss of his job, but at the unfairness of the situation he found himself in. At the police station, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal. Henry was taken to an interrogation room, where Bradley began bombarding him with questions. The teacher responded to each of them calmly and precisely, but it was clear that the officer wasn't really listening. "Your name?" Bradley asked, his tone accusatory. "Henry Wallace," replied the professor patiently. "Occupation?" "Retired university professor." Bradley let out a sneer. "Professor? And I'm the President of the United States." "Come on. We know you're the fugitive we're looking for. Why don't you make things easier and confess already?" Henry felt a wave of indignation rise within him, but he maintained his composure. "Officer, I understand that you are doing your job, but I can assure you that there has been a terrible misunderstanding. If you would just check my documents—" "No more lies!" Bradley slammed the table, making Henry startle. "You will stay here until you decide to cooperate." With that, Henry was taken to a cell. The metal bars closing behind him sounded like a dark echo in his ears. He sat on the hard concrete bed, his mind replaying the events that led him here. How could a man who dedicated his life to public service and the pursuit of truth find himself in such a situation? Meanwhile, outside the police station, news of Henry's arrest began to spread. People who knew him, former students, university colleagues, neighbors, were shocked to hear about the incident. A small crowd began to form in front of the police station, demanding explanations and Henry's immediate release. Among the protesters was Sarah, a former student of Henry's who now worked as a lawyer. She tried to enter the police station to speak to her old teacher, but was blocked from entering. "You can't keep an innocent man locked up without charges," she shouted at the officers at the door. Inside the police station, young Officer Miller watched the scene with increasing discomfort. He had witnessed Bradley's approach to the station and now, seeing the community's reaction, he began to question whether they had made a terrible mistake. Miller decided to investigate on his own. He took out Henry's documents that had been confiscated and began to check them thoroughly. As he did so, a more experienced officer, Captain Sarah Williams, noticed his activity. "What are you doing, Miller?" she asked, approaching his desk. Miller hesitated for a moment before responding. "Captain, I'm checking the documents of the man we arrested today. Something doesn't seem right about this situation." Captain Williams frowned, but her curiosity was piqued. "Let me take a look," she said, reaching for the documents. As the two officers examined the papers, their eyes widened with a shocking discovery. Henry Wallace wasn't just a retired professor. He was a retired Supreme Court justice known for his fair trials and his work defending civil rights. "My God," Captain Williams whispered. "We need to release him immediately." The news spread quickly through the police station. Officer Bradley, upon being informed of the monumental mistake he had made, felt the blood drain from his face. He had arrested and humiliated one of the country's most respected judges. Henry was immediately released from his cell. When he came out, he found a police station in complete chaos. Officers were running around, phones were ringing incessantly, and at the center of it all was Captain Williams, trying to control the situation. "Mr. Wallace," she approached him, her voice shaking with shame and regret. "On behalf of the entire police department, I would like to offer our sincerest apologies for the terrible mistake we made." Henry looked at her, his eyes tired but still shining with an unwavering dignity. "Captain," he began, his voice calm but firm, "what happened today goes far beyond a simple mistake. It is a symptom of a much larger problem in our justice system." As he spoke, Henry noticed Officer Bradley standing a few feet away, his face a mask of guilt and fear. For a moment their eyes met, and Henry saw something that surprised him, a flash of genuine shame and regret. Outside the police station, news of Henry's release spread quickly. The crowd, which had grown considerably, broke into applause and shouts of joy when he finally left the building. Sarah, his former student, ran to hug him, tears of relief in her eyes. "Professor Wallace," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "we are all so happy that you are safe. But it cannot stay like this. We must take legal action against this injustice." Henry placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're right, my dear. But how we approach this is crucial. We cannot fight injustice with more injustice." In the days that followed, Henry Wallace's case became a flashpoint for discussions about racism, police abuse of power, and justice system reform. Journalists from across the country descended on the city, eager to hear the story of the retired Supreme Court judge who was wrongfully imprisoned. Henry, in turn, decided to use his experience as a platform for change. He began giving talks at universities and community centers, sharing his story and discussing the systemic failures that allowed such an incident to occur. Meanwhile, within the police department, an internal investigation was launched. Officer Bradley was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing, and young Officer Miller was praised for his initiative in investigating the case further. Captain Williams, determined to make things right, invited Henry to a series of meetings with the department's leadership. Together, they began developing new training protocols, focused on combating racial bias and promoting a more fair and equitable approach to policing. Weeks passed, and the day finally arrived for Officer Bradley's disciplinary hearing. The courtroom was packed with community members, police officials, and the press eager to see the outcome. Henry was called to testify. As he stood to make his way to the witness stand, a respectful silence fell over the room. He looked around, his gaze finding the faces of Bradley, Miller, and Captain Williams before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," Henry began, his voice calm and measured, "what happened to me that day at Grand Central Station was not just an individual mistake. It was the result of deeply rooted prejudices and systemic failures in our justice system." He paused, letting his words sink into the room. "However, I also believe that this incident offers us a unique opportunity. An opportunity to learn, to grow, and for real change. Henry then turned to look directly at Bradley. Officer Bradley, your actions that day caused me great pain and humiliation. But I am not here to ask for your punishment. I am here to ask that you and all of us do better, that we learn from this mistake and work together to build a truly fair and equitable justice system. Henry's words had a profound impact on the room. Many, including Bradley himself, had tears in their eyes. The judge, visibly moved, thanked Henry for his testimony and called a brief recess before announcing his decision. When the hearing resumed, the judge gave an impassioned speech about the importance of justice and equality before the law. To the surprise of many, he announced that he would not sentence Bradley to prison. Instead, the officer would be required to perform extensive community work, directly serving the communities he had harmed through his actions. The decision caused a wave of mixed reactions in the courtroom. Some applauded the restorative approach, while others felt the punishment was not severe enough. Henry, although initially surprised, found himself reflecting on the wisdom behind the decision. In the months that followed, Henry closely observed how Bradley and other officers carried out their community service sentences. He saw how working directly with marginalized communities began to open the eyes of many officers to the realities and challenges faced by these people. Bradley, in particular, has undergone a profound transformation. What started as a punishment soon became a personal mission. He began organizing mentoring programs for at-risk youth, using his experience to show the dangers of prejudice and discrimination. One day, months after the original incident, Henry received an unexpected invitation. Bradley had requested a private meeting with him. With some trepidation, Henry agreed. They met in a small cafe, away from the prying eyes of the media and public. Bradley, visibly nervous, could barely look Henry in the eye at first. "Mr. Wallace," he began, his voice shaking, "I know that no amount of apologies can undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that your words in that courtroom changed my life. You could have asked for my head, and no one would have questioned it. But instead, you chose the path of compassion and forgiveness." Henry listened carefully, seeing the sincerity in the eyes of the man in front of him. Bradley continued, "I've spent the last few months working in the communities I used to fear and judge, and I've learned more than I could have imagined. I've learned about resilience, about community, about the daily struggle that so many people face just to be treated with dignity." Tears began to form in Bradley's eyes. "I want to apologize from the bottom of my heart for what I did to you. And I want you to know that I am committed to spending the rest of my career working to right the wrongs I made and help create a truly fair justice system." Henry was silent for a moment, absorbing Bradley's words. Finally, he reached out and placed his hand on the officer's arm. "Officer Bradley," he said softly, "the true test of a person's character is not never making mistakes, but how they choose to learn and grow from them." Henry was silent for a moment, absorbing Bradley's words. Finally, he reached out and placed his hand on the officer's arm. "Officer Bradley," he said softly, "the true test of a person's character is not never making mistakes, but how they choose to learn and grow from them. I see you are doing just that, and that gives me hope for the future." Bradley looked at Henry with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, sir. Your words mean more than I can express." The two men spent the next few hours talking, sharing their experiences and perspectives. Henry spoke about his career as a judge, the challenges he faced, and the lessons he learned along the way. Bradley, in turn, opened up about his past, the circumstances that led him to become a police officer, and the prejudices he now recognized he had carried for so long. When they finally said goodbye, they both felt that something significant had changed. A bridge had been built, not only between them, but also between the communities they represented. Over the next few weeks, Henry decided to channel his experience into something constructive. He began writing a book, not just about the incident at Grand Central Station, but about the broader issues of justice, prejudice, and system reform. His notes, which he feared he had lost on that fateful day, had been recovered and now served as a starting point for this new project. While working on his book, Henry also became more actively involved in the community. He began speaking at schools and community centers, sharing his story and encouraging open dialogue about race, justice, and equality. One day, during one of these talks at a local school, Henry noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was young Officer Miller, who had played a crucial role in discovering the truth about his identity. After the talk, Miller approached Henry. "Professor Wallace," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you for sharing your story today. Your words have had a profound impact on me and my colleagues." Henry smiled warmly. "Officer Miller, it's good to see you again. How have things been in the department since the incident?" Miller hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's been challenging. Many of us are rethinking the way we approach our work. Your experience has forced us to look at our own attitudes and biases in a way we never have before." Henry nodded understandingly. "Change is never easy, but it is necessary. I'm proud to see that you and your colleagues are willing to do this difficult work." Miller then asked a question that caught Henry by surprise. "Professor, we were wondering, would you be willing to come speak to our department? Share your perspective directly with officers? I believe this could have a real impact on how we approach our work." Henry pondered the proposal for a moment. The idea of entering that police station again, the place where he had been unjustly detained, made him feel a pang of anxiety. But he also recognized the importance of this opportunity. "You know, Officer Miller," he finally responded, "I think this is exactly the kind of dialogue we need to be having. I would be honored to speak to your department." In the weeks that followed, Henry worked with Miller and Captain Williams to organize a series of workshops with the police department. These workshops would not just be lectures, but interactive discussions, where officers could share their own experiences and challenges. The first workshop was tense at first. Many officers appeared uncomfortable, some even hostile. But as Henry shared his story and invited others to do the same, the barriers began to come down. A veteran officer, with tears in his eyes, shared how years of working in high-crime neighborhoods had left him cynical and prejudiced. "I didn't even realize how much this was affecting my judgment until I heard your story, Professor Wallace," he admitted. Another officer, a young woman, spoke about the challenges of being a minority within the police force. "Sometimes I feel caught between two worlds," she said. "I want to serve my community, but I also see how some of my peers treat people who look like me." As the sessions continued, Henry noticed a gradual change in the officers' attitudes. They began to open up more, question their own assumptions, and look for ways to improve their interactions with the community. Captain Williams, inspired by the success of the workshops, decided to implement significant changes to the department's training and policies. She worked with Henry and other community leaders to develop new protocols for approaching and interacting with the public. Meanwhile, Henry's book was progressing well. He decided to expand his scope, incorporating not only his own experience, but also the stories and perspectives he had collected during his workshops with police and his community talks. One day, while working on a particularly challenging chapter, Henry received an unexpected call. It was from a producer of a major national news program. They wanted to do a special series about his case and the impact it was having on police reform. Henry hesitated initially. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, and the idea of reliving his experience on national television made him apprehensive. But after talking to his family and friends, he realized this could be an opportunity to bring the conversation about justice and equality to an even wider audience. Filming for the special took several weeks. Cameras followed Henry at his lectures, workshops with police, and even in more intimate moments at home as he worked on his book. The producer also interviewed Officer Bradley, Officer Miller, Captain Williams, and several community members who had been impacted by Henry's story. When the special finally aired, the impact was immediate and powerful. Social media exploded with discussions about racism, police reform, and social justice. Henry's book, which was about to be released, quickly became one of the most pre-ordered books in major online bookstores. But not all reactions were positive. Henry began receiving threats from individuals who saw his message as an attack on the police. Some conservative commentators accused him of promoting an anti-police agenda and exaggerating his experience for personal gain. Despite the negativity, Henry remained steadfast in his mission. He continued his workshops with police, expanding the program to other departments across the country. His book, when finally released, became an instant bestseller, generating even more discussion and debate. A year after the incident at Grand Central Station, Henry was invited to give a talk at the prestigious TED conference. Before a global audience, he shared not only his personal story, but also his vision for a more equitable and compassionate justice system. "What happened to me that day could have left me bitter and resentful," he told the silent audience. "But instead, I chose to see it as an opportunity to open a dialogue, to build bridges, and to work for real, lasting change." He continued, "We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future. And that future must be built on a foundation of mutual understanding, respect, and, above all, justice for all." As Henry concluded his speech, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Among the applause, he saw familiar faces: Officer Bradley, Officer Miller, Captain Williams, and many others who had been part of his journey over the past year. In the months following the TED Talk, the movement started by Henry gained even more momentum. Police departments across the country began implementing training programs based on his model. Universities invited him to give lectures and even develop courses on social justice and reform of the legal system. Officer Bradley, inspired by the transformation he had experienced, decided to retire from the police force to dedicate himself full-time to community work. He founded a nonprofit focused on building bridges between police and marginalized communities, with Henry serving as an advisor. Officer Miller, on the other hand, was promoted and became a vocal advocate for police reform within the department. He worked tirelessly to implement the changes that had been discussed in Henry's workshops, facing resistance from some more conservative colleagues, but gaining the respect of many others. Captain Williams, recognized for her leadership during this time of change, has been named to a senior position within the State Police Department. In her new role, she was able to influence policy and practice on a much larger scale. Meanwhile, Henry continued his tireless work. His book has been translated into several languages and has become required reading at many law schools and police academies. He traveled the country and the world, sharing his story and his message of hope and change. One day, while on one of these trips, Henry received a call that left him emotional. It was from the office of the President of the United States. The President wanted to meet him in person to discuss his ideas on criminal justice reform. Henry was momentarily speechless. He thought about his journey, from an unfairly detained retired teacher to a national catalyst for change. He thought of all the people who had been part of this journey: Bradley, Miller, Williams, and countless others whose lives had been touched by his story. "It would be an honor, sir," he finally responded to the presidential aide. Weeks later, Henry found himself in the Oval Office, sitting across from the President of the United States. The conversation was long and productive, covering a wide range of topics related to criminal justice reform. "Professor Wallace," said the President at the end of the meeting, "your story and your work have been truly inspiring. I would like to invite you to lead a new national commission on police reform and criminal justice. I believe your experience and unique perspective would be invaluable in this role." Henry was momentarily stunned by the offer. It was an opportunity to effect change on a level he had never imagined possible. But it also represented an enormous challenge and responsibility. After a moment of reflection, Henry responded, "Mr. President, I am deeply honored by this invitation. If my experience and work can contribute to positive change in our nation, then I gratefully accept." The announcement of Henry's appointment to lead the National Commission was met with mixed reactions. Many applauded the decision, seeing it as a bold step toward meaningful reform. Others, particularly some more conservative sectors, expressed skepticism and concern. In the months that followed, Henry immersed himself in his new role with the same dedication and passion he had shown in all his previous endeavors. He brought together a diverse team of experts, academics, law enforcement officials, community leaders, and even former inmates, to address the complex challenges of the criminal justice system. The Commission held public hearings across the country, hearing testimony from people from all sectors of society. Henry insisted that these hearings be held not only in large cities, but also in small rural communities, ensuring that a wide range of voices were heard. During one of these hearings in a small Midwestern town, Henry had an unexpected encounter. An elderly woman approached him after the session, tears in her eyes. "Professor Wallace," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. My grandson, he was wrongfully imprisoned years ago. No one wanted to listen to us. But now, thanks to your work, we are finally getting a chance to tell our story." Moments like these reminded Henry of the true impact of his work. It wasn't just statistics or politics. It was real lives being affected. Families being reunited. Injustices being righted. As the Commission's work progressed, Henry faced significant challenges. There was resistance from police unions, criticism from politicians who accused him of being soft on crime, and even threats to his personal safety. But for every voice of opposition, there were many more in support. Officer Bradley and Officer Miller frequently spoke in support of the Commission's work, offering valuable perspectives from within the police force. Captain Williams used her influential position to advocate for the Commission's recommendations at the state level. After months of intense work, the Commission finally presented its final report to the President and Congress. The document detailed a series of wide-ranging recommendations for police and criminal justice system reform, including enhanced de-escalation and cultural sensitivity training for police officers, greater emphasis on community policing and relationship building, bail reforms to reduce disproportionate impact on low-income communities, investment in rehabilitation and reintegration programs for former inmates, creating civilian oversight boards for police departments' review and reform of use of force policies. The report generated intense national debate. While some praised it as a roadmap for meaningful change, others criticized it as too radical or not comprehensive enough. Henry spent the next few weeks defending the Commission's recommendations in media interviews, congressional hearings, and public forums. Henry spent the next few weeks defending the Commission's recommendations in media interviews, congressional hearings, and public forums. He repeatedly emphasized that the proposed reforms were not about being anti-police, but rather about creating a fairer and more effective justice system for all. "Our goal," he declared during a particularly tense Senate hearing, "is not to weaken law enforcement, but to strengthen it. By building trust between police and the communities they serve, we are creating a safer environment for all, including the officers themselves." As the debate over the Commission's recommendations continued, Henry received an unexpected invitation. A coalition of police chiefs from big cities wanted to meet with him to discuss implementing some of the proposed reforms. The meeting was tense at first. Many of the police chiefs were skeptical of the proposed changes. fearing they would undermine their department's authority. But as Henry explained the reasoning behind each recommendation, citing data and sharing personal stories, he began to see a shift in attitudes. One of the chiefs, a 30-year veteran of the force, spoke after a long pause. "You know, Professor Wallace, when I first heard about your case and your work, I thought you were just another anti-police activist. But listening to you today, I realize we're on the same side. We all want safer communities and a system of fairer justice." This meeting marked a turning point. In the weeks and months that followed, several police departments across the country began voluntarily implementing some of the reforms recommended by Henry's commission. Meanwhile, in Congress, a bipartisan group of lawmakers began work on a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill, based largely on the commission's recommendations. The legislative process was long and often contentious, with heated debates and intense negotiations. Henry has been called numerous times to testify before congressional committees, offering insights and answering difficult questions from both sides of the political aisle. His calm, measured approach, combined with his in-depth knowledge and personal experience, helped build bridges between opposing factions. After nearly a year of deliberations, Congress finally passed the Police and Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2026. Although it did not incorporate all of the Henry Commission's original recommendations, the law represented the most significant set of reforms to the criminal justice system in decades. On the day the law was signed, Henry was invited to be present at the White House. As he watched the president sign the historic document, he couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that brought him here. He thought of that fateful day at Grand Central Station, of the humiliation and fear he felt when he was unjustly detained. He thought about all the people he met along the way: Bradley, Miller, Williams, and countless others whose lives had been touched by his story. After the ceremony, the president approached Henry, shaking his hand warmly. "Professor Wallace," he said, "we could not have gotten here without you. Your courage and dedication have done more to advance the cause of justice than anyone could have imagined." Henry smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you, Mr. President. But this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work ahead of us to ensure these reforms are implemented effectively." In the months and years that followed, Henry continued his tireless work. He traveled the country, helping police departments and communities implement the new reforms. He wrote another book, this time detailing the process of creating systemic change and offering a plan for the future. Officer Bradley, now running his own nonprofit, has become a frequent partner in these efforts. Together they led workshops and panels, showing how collaboration between police and the community could lead to positive results. Officer Miller, who had been promoted to captain, implemented a pilot program in his department based on the reforms. The program's success attracted national attention and was soon replicated in other cities. Captain Williams, now state police commissioner, used her position to drive change at the state level, becoming a leading voice in implementing the new reforms. 5 years after the law was passed, a series of independent studies began to show promising results. Crime rates had declined in many areas, while trust between the police and the communities they served had increased significantly. The number of incidents of excessive force by police had fallen dramatically. On his 75th birthday, Henry was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. During the ceremony, the president praised Henry not only for his work on criminal justice reform, but for his courage in turning a traumatic personal experience into a force for positive change. After receiving the award, Henry was invited to give a speech. He stood at the podium, looking out at the audience full of familiar and unfamiliar faces, all united by their desire for a fairer justice system. "When I was unjustly detained that day at Grand Central Station," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion, "I could have chosen the path of bitterness and resentment, but instead, I chose the path of hope and action." He paused, his eyes sweeping the audience. What we have accomplished in recent years is not the work of one man. It is the result of the collective effort of countless individuals, police officers, community activists, legislators, and ordinary citizens, all united by the belief that we can and must do better. But our work is far from over, he continued. The reforms we have implemented are just the beginning. We must remain vigilant, continue to learn and grow, and never lose sight of the ultimate goal: a truly fair and equitable justice system for all. Henry concluded his speech with a call to action. I urge each of you to continue this vital work. Whether you are a police officer, a community activist, a legislator, or simply a concerned citizen, you have a role to play in building of a more just future. Together, we can create a justice system that truly lives up to its ideals. As the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, Henry felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He knew his journey was far from over, but looking back at all that had been achieved, he felt renewed hope for the future. In the years that followed, Henry continued his work, albeit at a slower pace. He focused on mentoring the next generation of leaders and activists, sharing his experiences and insights in lectures and seminars at universities across the country. He also took time to write his memoir, detailing not just his experience with the criminal justice system, but his entire life, from his childhood in a working-class neighborhood to his career as a teacher and judge, and finally his unexpected role as catalyst for national reform. On his 80th birthday, Henry received an exciting surprise. A group of former students, colleagues, and people whose lives he had touched over the years came together to create a foundation in his name. The Henry Wallace Foundation for Justice and Equality would be dedicated to continuing his work by providing scholarships to students interested in criminal justice reform and funding innovative policy research. During the groundbreaking ceremony, Henry was greeted by a series of speakers, including Officer Bradley, now a respected community leader, Captain Miller, who had become Chief of Police, and former Captain Williams, now Governor of the state. They each spoke about how Henry had changed not just their careers, but their lives. Bradley, in particular, moved the audience as he described how his initial encounter with Henry led him on a journey of self-discovery and redemption. When it was Henry's turn to speak, he slowly stood up, leaning on a cane for support. Despite his advanced age, his eyes still sparkled with the same intensity that had inspired so many over the years. "Friends," he began, his voice a little weaker but still full of conviction. "When I look around this room, I see the true legacy of our work. It's not just the laws we change or the policies we implement. It's the lives we touch, the minds we open, the hearts we transform." He paused, looking at the faces in the audience. Young students full of idealism, police officers committed to change, tireless community activists. "The work we began," he continued, "will not end in my lifetime, nor in yours. It is ongoing work, passed down from generation to generation. Each of us has a responsibility to do our part, to leave the world a little better than we found it." Henry concluded his speech with a message of hope. "I have seen great changes in my life. I have seen barriers broken down, prejudices challenged, and systems reformed. And I know that with the dedication and commitment of people like you, we will see even bigger changes in the future. Keep the faith, keep fighting, and never lose sight of the power that each of us has to make a difference." As the audience rose to its feet in a final ovation, Henry felt a deep sense of peace. He knew his personal journey was coming to an end, but the work he had begun would continue far beyond his years. Over the next few months, Henry spent most of his time at home, surrounded by family and close friends. He continued to receive visits from students, activists, and public officials who sought his advice and guidance. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Sitting on his favorite porch overlooking a city park, Henry closed his eyes for the last time. He departed peacefully, leaving behind a legacy of change, hope, and an unwavering belief in the power of the individual to make a difference. The news of his death was met with an outpouring of tributes from across the country. Political leaders, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens expressed their gratitude for Henry's work and his lasting impact. His funeral was a landmark event, bringing together people from all sectors of society, from the President of the United States to the local bus driver whose life had been touched by the reforms Henry helped implement. Officer Bradley, now a graying man, gave an emotional speech at the funeral. "Henry Wallace taught me that it's never too late to change," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "He showed me that even in the darkest times there is always hope. His legacy will live on not only in the laws and policies he helped shape, but in the hearts and minds of all those he inspired to fight for a more just world." In the years that followed, Henry's work continued to influence public policy and national discourse on criminal justice. The foundation that bore his name has grown to become a powerful force in promoting justice reform and training the next generation of leaders. Universities across the country have established professorships and programs of study in Henry's name, dedicated to exploring issues of social justice and legal system reform. His books have become required reading in law, sociology, and criminal justice studies courses. 10 years after his death, a statue of Henry was unveiled in front of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. The inscription on the statue's base read simply, "Henry Wallace, teacher, judge, reformer. He taught us that true justice begins with compassion." Henry Wallace's story, from an unjustly detained teacher to a national catalyst for change, has become an integral part of the American narrative. It was a story of resilience, of hope, and of the transformative power of an individual to make a difference. Most importantly, it was a story that continued to inspire future generations. Young activists, early career police officers, aspiring law students, all found in Henry a model for how to confront injustice with dignity and determination. In classrooms, boardrooms, and courtrooms across the country, the spirit of Henry Wallace lived on. His unwavering belief in the possibility of change, his tireless dedication to justice, and his deep compassion for humanity continued to shape the course of the nation long after he was gone. And so, Henry Wallace's story did not end with his death. It continued to unfold in the lives of those he touched, the institutions he helped reform, and the spirit of hope and determination he left as his lasting legacy. For as Henry often reminded everyone he met, the quest for justice is not a journey that can be completed in a single lifetime. It is an ongoing effort, passed down from generation to generation, each one building on the efforts of the previous one, always striving to create a more just and equitable world for all. And so, the story continues, not just in the pages of history books or on the walls of museums, but in the daily actions of countless individuals inspired by the example of Henry Wallace. Every act of kindness, every effort to combat injustice, every moment of courage in the face of adversity, all echo the fundamental lesson that Henry spent his life teaching, that a single individual, acting with conviction and compassion, can change the world. And so, Henry Wallace's story came to an end, but his legacy continued to live on. In the classrooms where his story was taught, in the halls of power where his ideas still resonated, and in the hearts of those who were inspired by his journey, Henry's spirit endured. The final lesson of his life, that justice is an ongoing path, not a destination, remained a beacon of hope and a call to action for generations to come. And in each new fight for equality, in each effort to right an injustice, the echo of Henry's voice could be heard, reminding us all that the power to change the world resides in each of us. So, although Henry Wallace's life came to an end, his story, a story of courage, perseverance, and transformation, would continue to be told, inspiring countless others to follow in his footsteps in the never-ending quest for a more just and equitable world for all.